For today, but we are just going to wait a couple of minutes for everyone to join. We're bang on 2 o'clock here in Brussels, but let's give it a couple of minutes for more to join. In the meantime, please introduce yourself in the chat. Say your name, organization, where you're from. It'd be great to sort of get to know who's joining us as well. So yeah, we'll get started in a couple of minutes, but feel free to sort of say hello via the chat box at the bottom of the screen. And for those who have just joined us, hello, good afternoon. Like I said, my name is Jack from Zero Waste Europe. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We are going to, as usual, sort of wait a couple of minutes for everyone to arrive and to join. But in the meantime, as Natty and Alan have done, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to hear where you're from, geographically and organizationally. And then, yeah, we will get started in a couple of minutes with our excellent lineup of speakers. Indeed, the sun is shining in Brussels. It's not too often you can say that. Not too warm. All right, we're just going to give it 1 more minute before we get started. But like I said, please feel free to say hello in the chat, where you're dialing in from, and then we will get started with today's webinar. We've got a lot to discuss in 90 minutes. Okay, let's get going. We are at 2 minutes past 2 here in Brussels. We can start the webinar. There's still some more people joining, but first and foremost, thank you very much for joining today's webinar. We are greatly appreciative of your time, and yeah, super excited to get going with this. We have an excellent lineup of speakers, and this is our first webinar as part of a new semester of Zero Waste Europe live webinars that we organize. Yeah, it's the first one back over the summer, so thank you for joining. Our webinars happen sort of once a month now, starting from October. November, December, we take a month off in January, and then we go to June. And we cover a wide range of topics related to waste, zero waste at the local level, the European level. And we coordinate this, well, via Zero Waste Europe, where I'm from. For those that don't know our organization, we're Brussels-based, NGO working on advocacy at the EU level to achieve a zero waste society. We're also a network of organizations implementing zero waste strategies at the national and the local level. And it's really at the local level where my work is centered, where we have our Zero Waste Cities program, which is dedicated to help cities and communities, cities of all sizes, sort of transition towards becoming zero waste. It brings together a European platform for local stakeholders on our Zero Waste Cities website to really help build awareness and capacity on how to implement best practices most effectively. We also have created the world's first Zero Waste City certification. Today, we have nearly 500 European municipalities in 15 countries who have committed to go zero waste. But a big part of the work that we do in the Zero Waste Cities program is to build and share knowledge around the key topics of zero waste today, most relevant for those working at the local level, but also at the European, at the national level too. And of course, today's webinar topic is exactly this in terms of relatedness to most important topics of today. So let's get started. According to the International Energy Agency, IEA, the world is experiencing the first ever truly global energy crisis in our history. And for those of us in Europe, the situation is especially perilous, which the IEA claims is at the epicenter of the energy market turmoil. And it's really exacerbating problems that existed before, that have only worsened because of the war in Ukraine. And in mid-2022, the European Union released a new strategy called Repower EU that aims to end the EU's dependence on Russian fossil fuels. whilst also tackling the climate crisis. Whilst the energy crisis provides an immediate threat to citizens today, the longer-term costs and damage caused by inaction against climate change remain far greater. Therefore, it's imperative that decision makers ensure our long-term goals of creating a circular, net zero society remain at the center of any short-term deals to increase energy availability. So, during the webinar today, each of our 3 speakers will present for 10 minutes. After every presentation, we will have 10 minutes for clarifying questions as well, so please submit these by the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Like people are doing, introduce yourself via the chat box, and we're also watching this via YouTube as well. So yes, hello to those on YouTube. If you want on YouTube, please submit your questions via the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, and by the magic of modern technology, they'll work their way through to me to related speakers. So without further ado, let's get started with our first speaker, who is Doreen Fodrigo. She is the Industrial Transformation Policy Coordinator at the Climate Action Network CAN Europe, where she leads the production and consumption team. Doreen has more than 30 years NGO experience at both the UK and EU levels, and has worked on files ranging from waste, recycling products to sustainable consumption production, bioeconomy, and the circular economy. At CAN Europe, Doreen leads the industrial transformation work, focusing on driving industry to achieve headline EU environmental objectives. This particularly means extending the focus beyond just technological decarbonisation, really taking a holistic approach to eco-design of products and processes and alternative business models that get value out of reduced and cleaner resource and energy usage. And this is exactly what we want Doreen to share today, given the context, to really help set the scene. So Doreen, I invite you to share your screen and to kick us off today.
Great, thanks, Jack. And while I'm trying to find how best to share my screen most immediately, here we go. That's very helpful to have gone through my full bio, because what it means is I don't have to talk so much about some of the slides coming up. Let me just see if I can do this, which I thought I could do. Here we go. So now I won't be able to see very, very much. And I wanted to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who's in the call. Great to see such interest. I think there's a lot of work to be done, as we'll see as I go through the small number of intense slides. So what I wanted to do is really focus on the bottom half of this slide by saying that I've changed my title to Industrial Transformation Policy Coordinator to help not just CAN, but also to get messages out of the climate movement to stop just talking about industrial decarbonization or focusing on decarbonization, so that we can take this holistic approach, which is looking at things like the eco-design of products, of production processes, looking at technologies, looking at when they're needed, which ones, with what environmental and social profiles, avoiding the burden shifting that we've seen as we've looked at things like the Eco-Design Directive in the EU, shifting onto other impacts so that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Also,
sorry, yeah. Very sorry to interrupt. I think your computer screen is frozen. Sure.
Are you on the second slide, the CAN Europe's industry work?
No, we're still on the first one, but the
Oh, this is interesting. Okay. Oh, that's scary. Okay, hold on a second. Let me just see if I can fix that. I don't understand why.
No problem. If not, I have your presentation slides up here. You can try and share.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah, maybe let's just do that so we don't waste time. So I'll stop sharing.
Perfect. And then
we'll need to go to my slides. Okay. So if you go on to the second slide, yeah.
Here we go.
Lovely. No, go back one. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So essentially what we're trying to do is take a systemic and a holistic approach. We're not just looking at pure greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We're looking at things like the links between climate and materials or resources. Also because that obviously touches on the biodiversity crisis through habitat destruction. We talk about pollution through circularity, the circularity agenda. And what you'll see right at the bottom of the screen, which is something that we're now, thanks to Repower EU, trying to push much more systematically and learning ourselves in terms of the demand side management needs and sufficiency. So sufficiency is one of the ways that we address this issue of absolute reduction of resource and energy use. So if we go on to the next slide, because essentially what I'm trying to explain to people is the work that we're doing, very much driven through our production and consumption or through the industry focus, is to break out of just the pure greenhouse gas emissions and looking at how we make links to other environmental impacts whilst also addressing the social impacts. And what you'll see on this slide is where we are and what we say. I won't talk very much about the left-hand side. Those are the kinds of industry dominated and industry policy focused bodies that we find ourselves sitting in by choice, obviously. And the picture on the left-hand side shows you more or less what the reality is. These are rooms full of older white men with a certain vision, let's say, of the world. And if there are old white men in the call, maybe it's not directed towards you, but there is a certain mentality that we see that continues to come through, which is, going to the right-hand side, a too strong focus on narrow technological decarbonization. So this whole focus on fuel switches, which is great, to renewables or green hydrogen, and energy efficiency and carbon capture and storage or use, okay? So we're pushing for the climate and resources materials links. We push very much the issue of the eco-design regulation coming through, the links to the industrial emissions directive coming through, and to the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Not always the most positive of tools, but those three pieces of legislation can help to create a market pull as well as a global level playing field, so that we avoid this whole risk of carbon leakage as we get dirtier products coming into the European Union from other countries, or we deindustrialize the EU. So there is also an issue through this narrow technological decarbonization focus to place a lot of the hope, a lot of the intentions on breakthrough technologies, some of which are still unproven, most of which are very, very expensive. And so there is a question about who pays for this. And what we hear constantly from at least heavy industry is it's the public. We need more funding. We need easier access to state aid. We need relaxation of rules. And we see this coming through. If we look at the 200 billion coming from the German government, we see this coming through, especially as we need to, in inverted commas, save EU industry. But what we're doing as well is increasing, therefore, the tension between what we're giving to industry versus how we're helping the actual public. And so the whole social justice and the social discontent rises up, and we'll likely see this happening as we go through this winter. There's another issue about strategic dependencies with this growing list of products and components, where the tensions are worsened by this techno-optimistic approach, which needs more and more rarer and geostrategic elements. If we think of countries withholding materials such as magnesium or even components, it means it creates a lot more tension than if we were to go through something that is much more along the lines of what a lot of civil society organizations are talking about, circularity. If we go on to the last slide, I'm trying to look for, hooks going forward, okay? On the right-hand side, what you see is the 4 headline messages that we communicated earlier this year in relation to the Repower EU package that came from the European Commission, which, as Jack said, is in reaction to reducing Russian gas demand into the EU due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this is also what we're building on as we go forward into the winter preparedness and the movements that are happening still now, the packages that are being developed. So what you don't see in what is the no energy to be wasted in that headline is this issue of feeding resource and energy reduction targets into existing processes. And I'll pick that up in the bullet points that I'll address now as briefly as possible. I've titled this Watching Fireworks, but Less Fun, because I've been thinking about all of these different processes and industries that are pulling in different directions. And it's really hard to know how to continue to maintain a path from what we're asking for is holding on to the immediate measures needed to get through, let's say, the difficult winter, although we're anticipating that this will last beyond the winter. Keeping that path from these immediate measures to the medium and longer term EU objectives, so that we're not rolling back, for example, increasing coal, increasing gas use again. So when I think about how we can, try to bring together all of these different, all of these factors that are pulling in different directions, what I've identified, at least now, is this need to anchor further and more deeply anchor the climate and materials or resources and products links. And what I identify here is the pieces of legislation or the policies that are on the table now. We have this eco-design of sustainable product regulation that is on the table, as well as the Industrial Emissions Directive. There is potential to build strong strengths in those. The NECPs are the National Energy and Climate Plans, which will be coming in 2023, 2024. And without explaining what the RRF and Next Gen EU are, they're pieces of funding, considerable pieces of funding that will be made available to governments, or is already made available to governments and to industries, to where ultimately they should be about developing or deepening an integrated approach and not just looking purely at the greenhouse gas reductions. When I come to the ESPR, there is great potential for this legislation to be a game changer. Also in terms of demand side measurements or measures. For example, that it can drive clean or sustainable products that provide alternatives, alternative options to the public, as well as to private buyers, whilst also helping to disturb this kind of productivist, consumerist economic models. So it won't necessarily change it won't create alternative business models, but what it can do is help to disturb by giving more prominence, let's say, to the better performing products, whether through incentives to the public or through green public procurement. It will also help to unleash parts of the manufacturing sector into eco-design. And sometimes, as we've seen with heavy industry, there are very, very important incumbents and federations that have quite some influence on EU policy. Whereas this is much less so in the manufacturing sector because there has been less history, let's say, of working so closely with DGs such as DG GROW, okay? What we're hoping is there can be an easier disturbance of the system. We need an increased focus on prevention through eco-design, which also helps to lead to these alternative business models. And what you'll see down at the bottom is this issue of, for example, mobility. How do we push the sharing economy so that people are taking part in car sharing schemes and not just buying personal vehicles? We'll have to get towards grounding of private jets, of pushing against SUV-sized vehicles, of truly supporting the shift from road or air to rail. And then the last thing I'll talk about is there's a lot that is going on, at least on the industry side, which is non-legislative. And so those are some of the bodies that I listed in a previous slide. And one of them is the Industrial Forum, where there are a series of industrial ecosystem transition pathways that are being developed. And I won't go into long detail about that, but essentially an industrial ecosystem is beyond a value chain. There are a number of different players, including public authorities, including funding institutions around a given sector. And there is potential to go into a more holistic approach, which we hope will then have an impact on future legislation, so that we're not just dealing with, here we're talking about climate, here we're talking about waste, here we're talking about recycling targets, that we actually build something that is much more helping us to get to the system change and not the climate change that a lot of people talk about. And I leave it there. I think if you go to the last slide, what you'll see is links to resources, but please get in touch as needed. Thanks a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Doreen. That's a brilliant sort of way to get us going for this webinar in terms of setting the scene and looking at the impact this had on our broader sort of consumption and production patterns. A couple of questions for you. First of all, let me remind participants to, if you have a question for Doreen and our other speakers, feel free to put them in the Q&A box specifically. But I'm going to use the moderator's privilege here whilst we wait for those to get us started. So Doreen, you mentioned it, I mentioned it at the start, but like this Repower EU strategy, I wonder if you could take 30 seconds or a minute just to sort of describe what is happening, what the EU plans to do with that to really help tackle the energy crisis whilst keeping climate goals, circular economy goals sort of front and center of the EU's priorities.
Actually, thanks, Jack. What you'll have to appreciate is that as somebody who's working on industry within an organization that's working on climate and energy and dealing with money, industry appears everywhere. And so we can't follow everything. And where I have colleagues that I think, okay, you can deal with most of Repower EU, what I'm interested in seeing at the moment is building on from Repower EU and heading towards the winter preparedness is all of the issues about what we're doing about price caps, and that there is a proposed 15% reduction on gas demand that I think is actually, I don't want to be suggesting that I'm going to be flippant about the situation, especially in relation to any Ukrainians who might be on the call. But whoever said you mustn't waste a crisis, I think what we're seeing is that COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is considered much more of an important crisis for our EU leaders than the climate and biodiversity and all the other crises that we are actually living through and have been for decades. And so there are options on the table now. The idea of reducing 15% our gas demand, in coming weeks is incredible. That's quite a shift, especially as it's higher than the 14.5% of overall energy efficiency that has been proposed through the EED, the Energy Efficiency Directive. So things are possible, and the question is, how do you anchor them? And a lot of the work at the moment is about how we continue to speed that shift, the energy transition, strong focus on that, realizing that a lot of that means new build, that we won't get the renewables online in the time needed. So we're struggling, I think, at the moment with what is going to be possible in the short time available that will actually help to get that move going forward towards the energy transition, whilst we're also trying to safeguard elements of business as usual so that we're not closing down. And I think we're struggling with that. We can see that we're struggling with that. I'll explain more if there's time, but I just leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's a expansive answer. There's so many issues, subtopics to delve into here and different things at play. But maybe building on that, one of the sort of 4 main strategies I think you highlighted that you're working on. One of them was no energy to be wasted. I suppose from a resource or a consumption view, what does that look like, practically speaking? Yeah, if you just talk about that.
So it's a mix of things. We do a lot within CAN Europe. There's much more of a focus on the residential sector. So we're doing a lot of, we'll need the local energy communities. We need, what we call self-consumption for some reason. It's the installation of the photovoltaic panels, realizing that, there will be limits on what's available and how many installers can be there. And it's the energy savings. Yeah, so really pushing that forward. But on the energy savings side, it's not just about, getting people to turn down their heating and put on an extra jumper. It's not just focusing on the residential. We are also saying that needs to also happen in the public sector as well as in industry. And for me, what that means on the industry side, especially, and where the team and what we're trying to feed into all of those processes, the industry related processes, is how to get that into official, and ideally legally based documents that say industry will therefore need to reduce its resource use, at least, clearly its energy consumption by whatever target. And that is being heavily resisted. So we just keep pushing those kinds of things. It's the savings, it's the energy reduction, and it's the shift to the more local production and control of energy generation.
Brilliant, thank you. Yes, a final question that we've had from Oscar in the Q&A box. You mentioned that the sort of demand side policies, therefore, should be providing incentives to the public, economically speaking, so obviously to promote more sustainable, clean products, reusable products, etc., breaking with our sort of existing model. But are you able to sort of elaborate very quickly on sort of any specific economic incentives, tax reforms, or things that could actually lead to this change that you and CAN are working on?
So this is a whole other can of worms that we're also working on, whether it's the reform of the EU's economic models, whether it's the fiscal and financial reforms. We've, even beyond CAN and, across the environmental movement, we've been talking about environmentally harmful subsidies, the tax shift to the environmental bads from the environmental goods, such as labor, to pollution, resources, etc. At the EU level, obviously, we're still stuck with this, unanimity in council in order to introduce new taxes. But I think there will need to be, what we've seen already in places like France with the bonus-malus scheme in terms of, reusability, repairability, etc. I think we'll need to be pushing countries to install those kinds of shifts in their tax regimes, whilst we also work on, let's say, the lower, what I call the lower underground waves are over the longer term, which is about the reform of EU rules, so that we can eventually work on not just taxes, but also what we're talking about within CAN coming forward is the whole post-growth, not necessarily degrowth. That's a whole discussion within the organization, but that's that system change. We're going to have to go for the sources of the problems and not just deal with the symptoms as we've done. And that means the whole kind of growth paradigm and how we nuance that much more. I stopped there.
What a way to end, talking about our growth paradigm. No, thank you so much. I think that's a fantastic sort of overview of the broader sort of resource use, consumption, production models that we have and the effect it's had by the energy crisis. We're now going to invite our second speaker to join us to take a more of a sort of deeper dive into one waste stream, in particular, plastics. And so we have Delphine Levy-Alvarez, who is the European coordinator of the Break Free from Plastic movement. Delphine has been the driving force behind the development of the movement's strategy, linking it to the broader BFFP global movement, and has played a central role in the foundation of BFFP Europe since inception in 2016. And it now has more than 110, maybe 100 European NGOs under a common vision. You can correct me there, Delphine. But since 2016, Delphine is also the coordinator of the Rethink Plastic Alliance, which is a Brussels-based policy coalition working on plastic pollution issues across the EU, and has played a crucial role in securing ambitious legislation on single-use plastics at the European level. So, Delphine, I hand the floor to you. Feel free to present, of course, your slides, and yeah, I'll shut up there.
Thanks, Jack. Hi, everyone. Just want to specify that I'm not the one who wrote this very nice biography. I think it's always harder to say things like that about yourself. Yeah, so I have the pleasure to present to you actually for the first time a report that I co-authored with Amadeo Giotto, who actually happens to be in the webinar right now as an attendee, but he's the one behind all the data sets. So I'm not taking credit for his work, but I will be sharing with you the main results of this work, because it's particularly relevant in the conversation we are having today about the link with between zero waste and the energy crisis. So we were not extremely original. This report is called Winter is Coming, Plastic Has to Go. This report talks about how we can decrease plastic production, or how we have to decrease plastic production to reduce the European Union's dependence on fossil fuels, and in particular on fossil fuels coming from Russia. So as we have already heard from the previous speaker and from Jack, what the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has revealed, we knew about Europe's dependence on fossil fuel, but I think it has really showed it in a pretty harsh way, exposing people, especially poor households and small businesses, to skyrocketing prices for their energy bills. And it has really shown this dependence on one particular supplier, Russia. So out of all the suppliers that Europe has for its oil and gas, Russia is the biggest one. In 2020, which is the latest official data we have, 38% of the EU gas was coming from Russia and 22% of EU oil. And even after Russia has annexed Crimea, it has still increased. So despite what was already happening in Ukraine, the European Union and its member states haven't decreased their dependence on Russia since 2014. And that really shows like concerning disconnection between geopolitical and human rights realities and energy trade. The only countries that have reduced their reliance on Russian fossil fuel are Eastern European countries, which I think were very much more aware of the situation than Western European countries. So out of this situation, to really face the winter coming, the EU has adopted the Safe Gas for a Safe Winter plan. And the ambition of this plan is to reduce gas consumption by at least 15% by the 31st of March, which is considered the end of winter, apparently. Remember this 15% because that's the number we're going to find again in the analysis. What this plan shows is really a massive discrepancy between the measures taken against the consumption of fossil gas by the households and really the lack of attention we've seen towards the actual biggest consumers of fossil fuel and in particular gas, which is the industry, the EU member states industry. This is quite interesting to hear, like in many countries, people are being asked to shower cold or to, you know, turn off the heating, reduce their trips. Like all of the sort of measures are really, and the messaging in the media are really targeting people. Von der Leyen recently even said that we could turn off the electricity in certain sectors during the night. So there are different things happening that are really kind of always targeting the citizen. And we haven't heard much of some industry sectors, and in particular the ones that are consuming the most. And in this context, our focus went on to the petrochemicals industry that hasn't been mentioned at all in this plan. And when looking at the EU energy balance and crossing several of the Eurostat databases. So this is all official data that you can find on Eurostat. So there is just a presentation of it in a more digestible way. But what we find looking at the numbers is that the petrochemicals industry in the EU actually consumes 50%. Do you remember this 15%? In 2020, it was responsible for 15% of the fossil gas consumption of the EU. So it's practically what we are asking people to reduce by the end of winter. This is for the energy of the process and for the feedstock. So these industries are extremely energy intensive for their process, and they also use fossil fuel as feedstock to produce different kind of products, amongst which plastic is the biggest in terms of market. In Europe, or in the EU, I should say, we have 7 countries that are the biggest petrochemical producing countries. It's Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, France, Italy, and Poland. And when you look at how much oil and gas consumption their petrochemicals industry is responsible for, in some cases, it's really high. So if you look at the Netherlands, a quarter of all the gas consumed in the Netherlands goes to petrochemicals production. This is 25%. This is a lot. For countries like Germany, it goes to 15%. This is all available in the report if you want to dive in. We have been talking a lot about gas in the context of this gas for a safe winter plan, but we shouldn't forget about oil because this is also a source of energy used in many, many places. When you look at oil, we have similar data. 14% of all the oil consumed in 2020 in the EU was used to manufacture petrochemicals. In some countries, it's the share of that really increases. Like it's almost half of the oil consumed in the Netherlands goes to petrochemicals production. These numbers are really staggering. And if you look at those 7 biggest producers in Europe, together, they actually account for 75% of the EU final oil consumption and 81% of the fossil gas consumption. So these countries are not only the ones producing the most petrochemicals, they're also the ones consuming the most oil and gas in the EU. And what's interesting for us is to see that actually out of all the processes of the petrochemicals industry, plastic production is the largest consumer of oil, gas, and electricity, and in itself is the largest industrial oil and gas and electricity user in the EU. It's ahead of sectors like that we talk about a lot, like steel production, for example, or automotive production, or even road transportation with all the trucks and all of that. So plastic production uses more than these sectors. Sorry, we have a very good energy saving system in this building. So you'll see me a bit in the dark. So plastic production in the EU in 2020 was responsible for nearly 9% of the fossil gas consumption and 8% of the oil consumption. And it's interesting to not only look at it as like a share of the overall consumption, it's interesting to look at it as a share of the industrial consumption. So if you look at what the European industry uses in terms of fossil fuel, plastic production is also the most energy and feedstock intensive. It's a fifth of the industrial gas consumption of the EU, and it's 2/5 of the oil consumption in the EU. So it means that out of all these industries that are functioning right now, plastic production uses 1/5 of the gas and 2/5 of the oil. And this industry in Europe, and these numbers are relatively coherent with the rest of the world as well, more than 40% of what they produce is single-use plastic packaging. And in 2020, it was 50 million tons of plastic that we produced in Europe and over 20 million tons of plastic packaging. So the amount of fossil fuel for energy and feedstock that has been used to produce this 20 million tons of packaging is basically the final gas consumption of Hungary and the final oil consumption of Austria. So we're talking about the oil and gas consumption of an entire country going into producing packaging in Europe. And the 7 countries that are producing the most petrochemicals and plastic, not only are the biggest consumers of fossil fuel, they're also the ones that are producing the most waste and the most plastic waste in particular. So together, they're responsible for 77% of all plastic packaging waste. So when we look at these numbers, we really wonder, why aren't we addressing that? Why aren't we looking at the whole picture when we're trying to address this energy security crisis? Because we have several crises going on. We have a plastic pollution crisis on which the EU has been doing things for the last 5 to 6 years, and we are also negotiating at the global level a treaty to end plastic pollution. We are in a climate crisis. What happened this summer all over the world has really shown us the extent to which it's not just a threat anymore, it's actually happening. And we are now in an energy security crisis, in particular in Europe, but it's also affecting the rest of the world. And we continue asking citizens to reduce their consumption while we're actually understanding, looking at these numbers, that the ones that are consuming the most are the industry, and usually to produce products for which there is an alternative and for which we've been pushing for a long time to change not only the material, but really the system around it. And the answer to this energy crisis, besides asking people to reduce their consumption, has been to really marginally invest in renewable energy. But really, when the crisis started, people started to be sort of hopeful that at least it would trigger more investment into renewable energy. But this was a very, very short honeymoon for renewable energies, because most of the attention of the member states and the EU has been directed towards securing new trade agreements with the US or Norway or African countries like Senegal. So we have existing suppliers, obviously, beyond Russia. So we're already importing from Norway, Azerbaijan, Egypt, Israel, Algeria, and obviously the US, and a lot more since this deal that Trump signed with the EU to increase by, I think it's 2,400%, the LNG imports from the US to Europe. And after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the EU secured a new deal with the US to even more so increase these exports. And the amount that they have promised to export, at least, and continue every year until 2030, equals the Polish annual gas consumption. So it's not small amounts that we're talking about. And Europe is looking towards Africa, again, for resources. So they are trying to incentivize exploration in countries like Senegal, or secure new trade agreements with Nigeria. So this is really concerning because, again, instead of looking at our consumption, we are and reducing the amount of resources we're using for consumption in Europe, we're always trying to go and source this material and this feedstock in other places with absolutely no regard for the health and environmental costs that those countries are bearing and the communities in these countries are bearing for us and for our consumption in Europe. So in a crisis like that, it is really it's the opportunity to stop looking at quick fixes, but really looking at the system change measures that can really tackle at once, not only the energy crisis, but also the climate, biodiversity, plastic pollution, you can name them all. And it's important in that context to look at reducing fossil fuel consumption in the industry sector, starting with everywhere it's not necessary. And one sector where it's really a low-hanging fruit is really single-use plastics and packaging. We have zero-waste production and consumptions model that exist. We have alternatives that exist. We need to look at the way we consume to reduce that. And that really could contribute. It's not going to solve everything, but that really can contribute to bringing back energy security in Europe. So out of the data that we have extracted from the databases, we've also made projections that do not pretend to be like exact, or we don't have the amount of money that people like McKinsey or Systemic have to put in very expensive and very non-transparent models. But with using common sense, looking at what we're using today, what we could reduce, and you have lots of resources about what kind of unnecessary plastic and packaging we're talking about that could be reduced and for which alternatives exist. We can consider that a 50% prevention target could be definitely achievable. And if you combine that with a 90% recycling target by 2030, we could save the equivalent of the Czech Republic's final oil and gas consumption in 2020. And that in just 10 years. So Czech Republic has the presidency right now of the EU. This is not actually a choice on purpose, but this is also something that we really want them to understand. And really bring into the conversation on the energy security discussion more than just the transport and energy discussion. So our recommendations in that context is really to fasten and increase the ambition of the implementation of existing legislation preventing waste. So the Waste Framework Directive, the Single-Use Plastics Directive. Some countries still haven't implemented the Single-Use Plastics Directive. There was some articles in the press in the last couple of weeks. And even the ones who have implemented it with loopholes, allowing for specific still fossil-based plastics to continue being put on the market. So there is really a need to use existing tools, enforce them, but not only enforce them, really increase the ambition of these tools. We have an upcoming opportunity with the revision of the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, where we could have those prevention and recycling targets that I just mentioned before that could allow us to save the Czech Republic fossil gas and oil consumption in just 10 years. And we really need to also include in the discussion on the energy crisis measures that are restricting the non-essential use of oil and gas in the industry, and really looking at what we're consuming today and reducing wherever it's possible. I mentioned it at the start, we're discussing the plastics treaty. This plastics treaty is meant to cover the full life cycle of plastic. So the EU and its member states need to push for ambition on upstream measures. We need to eventually have a global cap on plastic production and the measures and the financing mechanisms that go with it. We need to stop urgently building new fossil fuel infrastructures, including petrochemicals facilities. That should start with a moratorium or a freeze on permitting new virgin plastic production facilities. There is a big project in Antwerp, just 60 kilometers away from Brussels, where the biggest plastic producer in Europe wants to build another big petrochemical facility to produce even more plastic, and in particular single-use plastic. This kind of projects in the current context that will last forever, because we will continue being in a climate crisis, needs to be stopped. And NGOs are fighting, but governments and the EU as a whole needs to put a hold, more than a hold actually, to pull the brake on this kind of projects. And obviously, we're talking about the whole industry. There should be real conversations about decarbonization, but real decarbonization, because right now the main decarbonization option they're talking about is technologies that haven't been proven or actually have been proven not working, like chemical recycling, or things like CCUS or CCS or hydrogen. So that's the main decarbonization that the industry is talking about right now. And obviously, we need to protect the workers in those sectors and have a conversation about just transition. And since the 7 countries that I mentioned that are producing the most plastic are also the ones producing the most waste, we need to start implementing the measures first in those countries. So Belgium, Germany, Spain, France, Italy, the Netherlands, and Poland. And that's it for me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Delphine, thank you very much. Yeah, for the excellent presentation. I think the report is just in the chat if anyone wants to check it out in more detail afterwards. Delphine, I'll give you a second if you want to put the light back on in your room, feel free. I don't know if that's part of your presentation to show energy reduction, but yes, thank you for the great questions as well that are coming in. And also thank you to your co-author for the report. I forgot their name, apologies, but yeah, great work to you both. A question for you, Delphine, to get us started. There's a couple of questions I think from Victoria and also Inali about the European Union. We have the Circular Economy Action Plan. There is a Single-Use Plastics Directive. You mentioned 40% of plastics is single-use plastic packaging. But don't we have a packaging waste directive? You know, what is RPA, what is BFFP doing at the EU level to really help tackle this issue? And a second question is for individuals on this call, what can they do to help get involved, to help support this work, particularly maybe if they're in the 7 countries that you mentioned at the end there, where we really need to take action?
Thank you, Jack. Yeah, so we have a packaging waste directive with targets that are not very ambitious right now, and we have been waiting for the proposal for revision of this directive. It was planned last year. Now it was planned in July. Now it's planned in November. So we're really expecting that it's going to be put on the table in November, and that we're going to have a fast co-decision process. Because as you know, once you have a regulation at the EU level, it doesn't mean that it's going to have any impact right away, because you have very long transposition period. So we really need to have this legislation on the table as soon as possible to start implementing those measures. But I do think that we should take, in the context of the energy crisis, some urgent measures as part of this sort of crisis package that the EU is implementing. So through the packaging waste directive, the objective is to reduce obviously all packaging, all single-use packaging, because I mean, we always say it at Breakfree, but I'm going to say it before people ask. We're not asking for substitution with other single-use material. We're not asking to switch from plastic to paper or from plastic to compostable, whatever. Or just single-use glass or metal. We are really looking into changing the way we produce and the logistic chains to foster reuse systems. Not only reusable products, but reuse systems, because you don't have a sustainable product, you only have a sustainable system. So this directive could help us do that, but it's very important that we also stop like working in bubbles or in silos, but bubbles is more cute, because the ones working on circular economy are very rarely talking to the ones working on energy or on climate. And we're not just working on cute little measures to foster, bring your own or zero waste shops. We are talking about measures that have the potential to change the way we consume, and our consumption and the production that is creating our potential for consumption is the one that is consuming the energy, is the one that is creating the climate crisis, is the one that is using all this fossil fuel. So these are real system change measures. And I think we have heard from climate campaigners or even from people from industry working on oil and gas that plastic was a problem of a straw in a turtle with a straw in the nose, that this is, oh yeah, we're going to ban straws and so what? No, we're talking about the most energy and feedstock intensive industry in Europe. We're not talking about just a random video on YouTube where a dolphin is choking on plastic bags. So I think it's really it is in the interest of the ones who don't want to change to make us think that this is not a real problem, that this is a small problem compared to energy crisis, compared to climate crisis, but it's actually the same problem. And not only it's the same problem, but it's also a real part of the solution. And that's, I think that's something that for us was very striking looking at the data. We were not expecting big numbers like that. I mean, we knew in a way that plastic was using so much oil and gas, but we didn't know to which extent. And what plastic, for example, the fossil gas that plastic production consumes in Europe is the same as the potential of new fossil gas that we could export from Africa. So let's look at what we're consuming rather than looking at extracting from other places. And I think that's really the message. This is a crisis, and this crisis should be an opportunity to think in a systemic way, rather than finding quick fixes, new trade agreements that are going to lock us in a situation where we're going to have to sort of continue importing, and those countries are going to have to extract, and is going to have an impact on the population, their climate, their water, their soil, their air, everything you want.
Absolutely, yes. Fantastic answer. So much to sort of unpick, and if only we had more time. But it's a brilliant report, and I want to you mentioned about the data gathering aspect there. Final sort of question, or maybe it's two questions here, because we have one from Alan about how do you sort of define, you mentioned in, I think, the penultimate slide, you want to restrict non-essential industry oil and gas use. And the question is, how do you define non-essential? And then let me sort of use that to sort of ask a bigger question about sort of how has the reaction been from these huge industrial companies that you sort of mentioned, you sort of cite in this report. Is there support, is there appreciation for this work happening within the industry, or is it a real sort of pushback and fight against some of the data you've been producing? So two questions there, my apologies, but hopefully tied into one answer if you can.
The last one made me laugh. But on the first one, we have a list in the report, but you also have references. We also reference other work by other organizations and some of our members actually, and some university that are looking into what kind of plastic we could eliminate. And even if you look at, for example, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, they have a whole guide on what kind of plastic can be eliminated and where we can redesign products. So these are things like wrapping for fruits and vegetables, or the tear off on the pot that you don't really need, or the packaging that is much bigger than what it actually contains, or the single dose, like the single portions. So you have lots of examples like that, and it sounds small because these are like small films, but the amount of production that there is of these things is huge. So the challenge we have with the data, to be honest, is that it's not very accurate in like the details, because unless the industry provides this data, it's not available. So we have to use what we know. We have to use our common sense to make projections on what we could save. But again, this report doesn't pretend to have all the solution. We're just laying out the problem and saying, hey, we think that by doing this, we could get there, but maybe it's your time to do your homework and ask the industry for the actual data. I also want to say that whatever we evaluated in the report is a lot less than the actual picture, because we were not able to include the oil and gas consumption of certain parts of the process, and in particular of the waste management process. So we're really using at how much, for example, plastic packaging consumes in terms of fossil gas and oil. But this packaging is also put on the market, also transported, also stored in fridges, and also ends up in an incinerator or a landfill. And there is at all these stages fossil fuel consumption. So this is obviously under-evaluated. The reception of the report, so far it's mostly been fighting with people countering the report without having read it. So it's mostly telling people from the industry who are attacking us, go to this page, check this reference. And most people have been quoting the McKinsey report that came out before summer as like the Bible for LCA. It is not, disclaimer. And also it's mostly US data. In the US, most waste is landfill, not incinerated, producing lots of greenhouse gas emissions like it is in Europe. So do not counter an actual a study that is really grounded in the realities of a territory with something that it's not. And also LCAs, you just make them tell what you want. So we are quoting a very interesting study by some of our members and a university, actually Zero Waste Europe, Jack, where they are listing the conditions to have reuse being more environmentally friendly than single use. And so we're not just talking about, switching to whatever reuse system with long distances and all that. We're really talking about smart systems that are relocalizing production, shortening the logistic chains, direct connection with the producer. So it's a mindset. It's not just numbers. It's a mindset, and it's a systemic view of what has to change.
Absolutely. Yeah, gosh, fantastic answers, real systemic. So many issues there. And like I said before, I think I'd love the time to really delve into this. There's also a brilliant question that we don't have time to answer you right now. I'll ask you maybe at the end of it about why biggest plastic producing countries, also the biggest plastic waste producing countries. But let me pause you there and say thank you very much for the presentation and the great sort of Q&A we just had. And Yobo, your question, I haven't asked it because I think our next speaker will be able to answer it in a much more informed way. And so I'm going to ask Dr. Dominic Hogg now to join us and to present. Dominic Hogg is the director of Equinamito. Gosh, pardon me, an awful pronunciation. But Dominic was the founder of Eunomia Research and Consulting, where he led the organization for over 20 years. Dominic has received a physics degree from Oxford, a master's from Wales, PhD from Cambridge University, and in 2020 he stepped down from Eunomia and founded Equinamito, still not great, please go, to spend more time working deeply on some of these key challenges, designing sort of policy mechanisms and strategies to really drive forward the change that we need. Dominic's going to present a bit more, focusing again on a specific issue, looking at incineration and waste energy incineration given the current context. So I'll stop there. Dominic, apologies for pronouncing your organization terribly wrong, but the floor is yours.
The name was chosen purely to make you struggle with the pronunciation. Entirely the reason. Anyway, good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us on this talk. So I'm going to talk about a report that's very shortly coming out about the possible, how we think about the effect of incineration on gas consumption. And that comes on the back of the industry itself leaping into this crisis, claiming that actually, they can be part of the solution. To be fair to the industry, they've also highlighted some of the positive role that can be played by recycling in this respect as well. But, you know, there's a fairly strong emphasis on in their pitch, as it were, on the amount of energy that can be generated from incineration and how that might displace gas and other fossil fuels. So this is the outline of the presentation. I'll get straight into it because I've got a fair few slides, but they're going to go fairly swiftly. So a quick background on gas use in the EU27. I saw one of the questions from Alan Potter on the question and answers. And Alan, as I mentioned there, and some of those of you who are interested, there is a lot of information about this on the Eurostat site, and I've put up the link there to the sort of gateway into that energy data for those of you who are interested. So let's have a look at gas available. So can you see my pointer if I play around with it here?
Yeah, that's good.
Yep. So here's it's probably quite a good idea to put gas use in context. So, you know, you're talking about overall share of energy use of the order 20%. And that's gone up just recently, but that's partly due to this decline in overall energy consumption. So it's not just about how much is being produced, which has remained more or less steady since back in 2011. There's not been a lot of variation in terms of the gas that's available for consumption in the EU. We're worried at the moment about winter because of this. There's a huge, great seasonal fluctuation in the use of gas across the EU. And that reflects partly, of course, its role as a heating fuel, but also in part its role in the electricity system as well. And as the winters get colder and the evenings draw in, as they currently are, we start to use more of that, that gas. And so here's roughly how the gas is consumed, and it's roughly split between transformation for energy use. So that's the transformation into things like electricity and heat, as we've shown here. And then there's what Delphine was talking about, the energy and the non-energy use by industry, about 27%. And then these other sectors accounting for around 36%. And the majority of that is household use. And that's quite important because when Eurostat data talks about heat production, it's usually talking about the heat production that's generated centrally through things like district heating networks. It's not usually talking about the use of gas in a boiler in somebody's home, which usually appears in this row here. So the sort of slightly odd thing with looking at data on heat production from Eurostat is that it covers those centralized systems, not the household systems. And there are actually plenty of countries who don't really have any derived heat generation. So comparability is easier on the electricity side than on the heat side. And here's the sort of trade balance bit. And here's where it gets quite interesting and why everybody's worried about imports. Because if you look at the fact that we've got similar quantities that the EU27 produces, and then it also exports, then of course the only consumption left, the only stuff left for consumption is roughly the same as whatever you import. And you can see how important imports are in the overall balance of gas demand in the EU. And of that, around 40% is imports from Russia. Probably not with a lot of love these days for the James Bond fans. So what's the role of incineration currently? Let's look at this currently. Now, of course, lots of countries have been doing this for many, many years. You had people responding to another energy crisis back in the 1970s and the 80s to actually start building a fleet of incinerators to have an impact on energy supply in their own countries, particularly in the Nordic countries. But over time, you've seen over the last decade an increase from around 1.2% of electricity supply to just over 1.4%. So there's an increase, but in most of the countries who've sort of got relatively mature waste management systems, this isn't changing a lot. It's countries like Poland that are seeing really significant multiples over the last decade in terms of the amount of electricity and heat that's being generated. But let's put this into context, going back to what type of share we might looked for ways to make in terms, if any, as a dent into the 15% target to reduce gas consumption. Well, you know, you've got we're talking about 1.4% now, and we're incinerating a lot of waste. And we probably can't incinerate much more, despite what the industry might like to think. But the share of coal has fallen from 25% to 13% over the same period. So you've got this drop of 12% of you know, one of the most polluting, or the most polluting form of fossil fuel generating electricity. So that fall is more or less, well, it's about 50 times the change over the last over the last 10 years that we've seen from incineration. So this is small. The amount that's generated, the proportion of the electricity generated varies across all of these different countries. And you almost have to drill into each one to understand why it's what it is. So in Denmark, you actually have quite a high share of electricity is being generated effectively from waste. And one of the reasons for that is that Denmark's generation of energy generally, and particularly of electricity, is falling, partly because of the way it's linked into the Nord Pool pricing arrangements with other with Norway, Sweden, and other countries, and what that does in terms of facilitating, if you like, imports of hydropower from those, particularly Norway and Sweden. So it's a relatively high share, but because its overall production of energy is falling. But for most of a lot of these countries on the left are already doing quite a lot of incineration. And some of them, like Sweden, the Netherlands, Germany, are also importing waste for incineration. So, you know, how much further can we go here? Let's look at heat, the gross derived heat production. And as I said earlier, lots of countries just don't report any gross derived heat production. They tend to be the warmer countries. So you look at Spain, you're going to build an incinerator in Spain, or if you've been building them in the past, you're probably going to use it to generate electricity, not heat. And in other countries, Sweden, you might be doing the opposite because of the way in which you might be feeding into district heating networks and the way you may have done that in the past. So what does this mean for what incineration has done for gas? Well, let's start with the really unrealistic assumption that every bit of energy that you generated from an incinerator was going to displace consumption of gas. It's clearly not true. There are lots of countries where you've actually got heating networks that are more or less completely decarbonized already, and indeed some where the electricity network is more or less decarbonized already. So it's just not going to be the case that you're always displacing gas. But anyway, let's do the exercise just to find out how big this share could be if we made that rather ridiculous assumption. And here you go, on the right-hand side, you've got this amount being generated. If we then say, well, okay, if I was generating from gas, how much energy would I need? It's that much, and that amounts to 1.9% of gas consumption. If I do the same with heat, I do a similar calculation, and I find that I'm potentially knocking out 1.8% of gas consumption. So all energy displacing gas, if that's my assumption, and all the electricity and heat is currently being generated by incineration would displace 3.7% of total gas consumption in the EU. It's not huge. Let's go for another assumption. Let's instead assume that instead of knocking out gas, every unit of energy knocks out the average mix of generation of either electricity or of heat that we're otherwise seeing in the EU, which is an assumption that some others have made in studies that they're doing on climate change and so forth. I happen to believe it's still not the right one, but hey, let's play the game. So what you get if you go down this route is you find that if you account for the fact that some of the electricity is being generated from waste, you take that out, you renormalize the share of gas, it's 20.4% of the total. So let's then multiply that by the previous number we had, which was 1.9%. And we come up with 0.5% of gas consumption being replaced by the electricity. Do the same with gas. We come out with a figure of 0.7%. So if we go for the average mix assumption, then all the electricity and heat that we've currently got is displacing 1.1% of gas consumption in the EU 27. It's not huge. And then you think, well, what does that mean going forward? Okay, let's think about this. There's a few options we have to get more energy from incineration at the moment. We could see from the existing facilities marginal increases in what we generate as either electricity or heat. Well, that assumes that we've got spare capacity and that we can do that. In which case, you know, what are we displacing? It might be reasonable to assume, particularly in the crisis we're in now, some would argue, that you might be displacing gas. But that takes a very short-term perspective, and it's questionable whether you're really going to attribute that to, you know, there's a question philosophically, is whether you want to attribute that to the incineration plant or simply to the fact there's a war. Because you probably won't be doing the same thing once the war stops, will you? And doesn't it also depend on what are the other policies that people are putting in place and how long you do this for? It matters. It matters what would otherwise happen in the energy system. You could also have a marginal increase in use of waste at places like cement kilns. But actually, at cement kilns at the moment, there's about 50% of all of the energy content of that the cement kilns use is already coming from alternative fuels. The other 50%, about 2% of that 50% is related to gas, diesel, and other fuels. So it's a tiny fraction. The main source of fossil fuel energy in cement kilns in the EU is petcoke, and the other main sources are coal and lignite. And actually, they might be constrained in how much they can substitute anyway. So to what extent are we really going to see big changes as a consequence of these activities? I don't think we are going to see many. And by the way, it can happen today. Nobody's actually stopping it. There are actually incentives actually to do some of these things, like using more alternative fuels in cement kilns. And by the way, Cembureau, the EU trade body for the cement industry, is actually arguing that more of the waste should come into cement kilns, not just from landfills, but also from incineration plants. So there's almost like a competitive side emerging here. But the real question is what's going to happen in the future? And how would you get significant additional sources so you contribute to that 15% reduction target? Well, then you've got to build new capacity. Can't really avoid it. And then you have to ask, well, if I'm going to build new capacity, would I really do that on the basis of short-term, hopefully, crises in energy markets, and then put in place a 20-year facility? I doubt that. I doubt it very much. That will have an impact on the revenue that the facility generates from the sale of energy. But in most situations, that will not lead to a sort of zero gate fee situation for facilities over the long term. And the second point is that even if you wanted to do that today, how long would it take for you to build it? And so it will probably take you, in some countries, as much as 7 years if you hadn't already started planning. Maybe in other favorable situations, it might be 4. But then finally, as we've been saying in other webinars through the year, if you did the right thing at the incineration plant, you'd sort out plastics from the leftover mixed waste so that they were lower in carbon intensity. And what you would do by doing that is you'd increase the capacity of the existing incinerators to manage waste. So you've got a very weak argument then for building more capacity. Rather, we're probably closer to a situation where we should be phasing some out and planning to do that. And then stepping away from the waste decisions, what's the most plausible counterfactual here in relation to energy supply? And if the member states really do speed up decarbonisation whilst enhancing security of energy supply, then even if you justified your new capacity, what would you really be displacing with that new facility? Might it not be that all you were really displacing was the other sources of what we call firm power, because you're not turning incinerators on and off, other sources of firm power in the energy mix that we're going to look for in future to displace fossil fuels. So it becomes incredibly difficult, I think, to sustain the view that at a new facility, you're going to be displacing any fossil fuels over the long term. think gas is likely to be used more as a balancing dispatchable fuel to match the variable supply coming from variable renewable sources in the future. That's me done. That's me when I was a kid. I was born at 0.2 degrees C. There is a report coming out on this. It will, I promise, come out before the global temperature has risen much above 1.1 degrees C, preferably by next week. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Dominic. We will share the slides afterwards, if that's okay. So everyone will have access to a very, very young Dominic. Yeah, far and wide on social media. No. Yeah, like we said, the reports will be published very soon. Dominic's written for Zero Waste Europe in the next couple of weeks, hopefully. So it's very exciting. But we have a question, Dominic. I think hugely invaluable stuff you're presenting on there. If you were to summarize, basically, we see, particularly here in Europe, a lot of cities, municipalities say, okay, maybe we should keep our incinerator or extend our incinerator because we don't want to lose an energy source. But what, in 30 seconds, 1 minute, for those on the call, what are the main arguments to give back to say, you know, this is why it's completely not necessary, incompatible with our future goals?
Well, just Jack, you've got a short-term question and a beyond the short-term question. The short-term response, you know, if somebody's literally going to be closing a facility or planning to close one tomorrow, then they might well think of extending its lifetime, depending on what else was going to happen with that waste. But here's the trick for that caveat there. As Delphine was suggesting, there's a huge amount of gas that's being used in making plastics, and that is the source of about half the calorific content of the waste that is being incinerated today. So the point there is what you're doing with that waste is you're effectively losing the embedded fossil carbon content in the material every time you put that material into an incinerator and you don't bother to recycle it. If you recycle it, you retain the embodied energy. Most life cycle assessments will be looking at the differential on the energy use in making primary and making secondary. But don't forget that if you burn something, you completely lose the embedded, what's sometimes called feedstock energy in the plastic, and you have to go and get it again and again and again and again every time you don't recycle it. So Delphine's point is entirely relevant about how we're going to actually address the crisis in the longer term. So I expect to see some short-term perverse responses, perverse in the context of climate change, as a means to respond to a war. I don't think it makes any sense to make long-term decisions or decisions that have an impact on the long term that are effectively banking on the war going on for the next however long. I hope they don't go on. I hope the war doesn't go on. I'm sure we all do.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think there's a question here from Manon. You mentioned sort of in the middle of your presentation, the sort of comparisons of the replacement for gas and for electricity. And I think it sort of overall sort of EU level data, but the question from Manon is whether you have the figures only considering sort of gas imports from Russia. That is possible or relevant from your research.
Well, first, just to reiterate, I don't think the figures are based on assumptions that I would think are the right ones to make. But having done the calculations, what I would say is all you've got to do is multiply the numbers by roughly 2.5, because the Delphine said earlier that, you know, gas from Russia is about 38%. I came up with a slightly different number. I think it was 43, but 1/43 is roughly 2.5. So under the average assumption, you'd be saying all of waste would do 2.5%. If you assumed every bit of energy was displacing gas from incineration today, you could say that that was equivalent to 2.5 times 3.7. So 7.4, 1.8, 9.2%. The problem is that's already there. That's already happening. So you're not actually displacing any more. You know, this argument about, am I going to have an impact on the level of imports happening? That's got to be over and above what we're doing today. Of course, there's a counterfactual that you can say, actually, I think if I wasn't doing this, things would be even worse, and I had to import more. That's entirely possible. But, you know, we'll be addressing those sorts of slightly more philosophical questions in the report.
Indeed, we look forward to reading the report. So I'm going to invite Doreen and Delphine maybe to sort of turn on the webcams, and gosh, we have 5 minutes left, so apologies for the general Q&A. But Dominic, thank you so much for the presentation, and yeah, sort of super informative. And like I said, the report will be out soon. But Doreen, I'm going to come to you first. First of all, just a chance to reflect on Delphine's and Dominic's sort of presentations and the discussions, but maybe a question around sort of, we have here in the chat, if you're happy to answer it, from Oscar about this point that Delphine made. We work in bubbles, silos. That was a nice word. What can we do to tackle an interlinked crisis where, even in your work, for example, you're looking at sort of huge industrial complex initiatives that involve so many different actors. So what can we do as an NGO, I suppose, or as NGOs to sort of become more efficient, more impactful in the work that we do on this topic? Yeah, big question, my apologies.
That's all right. That's all right. So thank you. It's been really interesting listening from all these different perspectives coming in. I don't want to answer directly, but I think in the last 2.5 years or 2 years or so that CAN Europe has been involved in the implementation of the industrial strategy, the EU's industrial strategy. What we are talking about is a different worldview that comes together and makes very evident and sometimes very uncomfortable tensions. So what we have is you have civil society, you have trade unions who are talking about the need to, you know, rethink what we're making, how we're making them, and getting especially heavy industry to develop its, so they have carbon neutrality plans, a lot of them. As I said, they're based on very, very heavy tech focus and really looking at fuel switches, okay? Without saying who's going to pay for those fuel switches and where we're going to place all of that renewables infrastructure. What they are resisting very heavily is anything to do with circularity, with resources, with industrial emissions aspects, anything that smacks of circularity. It's too complex, they don't have the control, etc. So it gets downgraded, it gets deprioritized, it gets ignored. And so the importance of not just coming with decarbonization plans, but coming with transformation plans. There are several tools that are on the agenda at EU level, some of them legislative and some of them non-legislative. It's a mess. It's like a plate of spaghetti, and what we need is for one of these to come to the top. And what we're suggesting as CAN is that should be the Industrial Emissions Directive. Although it's emissions, it encompasses, ideally, much more than that. And that's where we'll get the synergies, not in these individual, you know, sectoral roadmaps on decarbonization in order to get to climate neutrality. So that's really pushing really hard against industry, which is looking for business as usual. All they want is the shift, and we know that that will explode the electrification and the need for energy. So they're still maintaining this kind of, it doesn't matter what the energy carrier is, we need cheap energy. And that's what's very unhealthy for us going forward, okay? Whether we have the impacts here, whether we continue to export our major impacts on the rest of the world. So that's number one. Number two, these kinds of silos, which are not just between the NGOs, but even within the NGOs, let's say, is talking to each other. We know, so there are a number of EU level organizations, at least, that are working together across these different issues. And we need to continue to build those links and to go beyond. For me, increasingly, and within CAN Europe, what we recognize is, you know, climate justice is about social justice. So we are environmental organizations, but we have to reach out to the social justice organizations, that is not just about global North, global South. It is about the, unpapered, the diasporas, the poor, all of those marginalized. That needs to be strengthened as well. I don't have the answers for how we work together most immediately, let's say how we bring ourselves together, apart from through, I'll do a name check for an organization like the EEB that has working groups which we go into as well as climate organizations. So we're sharing that amongst our members. There's a lot of overlap, but that's a very broad church, let's say the EEB working groups. So let's meet there in a couple of weeks when they have their eco products working group. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Doreen. We are running out of time, but there's so much to get into. Delphine, I'm going to come to you. The final question. My apologies. We don't have more time to get into these really important and key topics, but in 30 seconds or 45 seconds max, why are the biggest plastic producing countries also biggest plastic packaging waste producers as well? Like, what is this link and how can we break it?
I mean, they're the Western European countries. They're the ones consuming the most in general. Therefore, they're the ones throwing away the most. It's as simple as that.
Simple as that. Amazing. Given that we have a little bit of 15 seconds left from Delphine's answer, Dominic, I don't know. There are some questions in the Q&A that are far too intense, but if you wanted to answer live some of the questions that we've had in a minute or so, now's the opportunity, or if not, we can sort of, share your contact details after. You're on mute, sorry, Dominic.
I saw a question about, figures and 9%, from, I think it was Chirula. I think my figures are, as I said in the verbal answer I gave, are very similar if you only look at Russian imports, but it's based on an assumption that every unit of electricity or energy that's generated by an incinerator is displacing gas. And I think that's the assumption that's most questionable. However, it might be less questionable today. I still doubt that it's true in all cases. The other point was about taxation and why was certain countries thinking of removing taxes. I think that's a bad call in my view, and there are several reasons for that. But certainly depending on the contractual situation for a particular incinerator or what have you, then in theory they're actually benefiting from increased revenues if they're selling that electricity at some form of price linked to market prices. They might not be. That might be part of the contractual situation. But that would certainly deserve some unpicking. And as I said in the main presentation, I don't know really why you necessarily expect that to increase the level of incineration at the margin. It may be more to do with how those Nordic countries in particular are competing for different waste streams to go into their own facilities. Again, the emphasis right now should be on how we get sensible carbon pricing for incinerators across the whole of the EU. And clearly the Nordic countries have been a little further ahead of the rest of the EU on that. And let's try and get that in a rational form so we don't have, if you like, different instruments such as taxes on incineration and incineration under ETS partly overlapping. I don't think that's desirable. I like efficiency in the use of policy instruments. But removing them to deal with the crisis, I feel, is a slightly strange thing to do. You've probably got a fiscal crisis as well, and it might help.
Exactly. We won't comment on that. You being based in the UK, Dominic, at the moment.
Everything's hunky-dory here.
And with that, we shall finish. Thank you very much to our three excellent, wonderful speakers. Thank you for giving up your time to present, and thank you all the attendees for joining. We know everyone is super busy these days and there's a lot of fatigue with Zoom, so we really, really appreciate your time to join us today. We have a very, very couple of last notifications. On the Zero Waste Cities website, you'll find more information about the next webinar, which is going to look at how to optimize organics collection systems in your city. It's on the 15th of November, so sign up for that now. In the tools section, you'll find the presentations from our speakers, their blessing to share after this. And then we also have a study tour, our first study tour in 3 years now, to Milan and Treviso. So if you're interested in getting to grips with how cities sort of fight against incineration, implement biowaste collection, reuse models, exactly the topics that we've discussed today, please sign up and join us in Italy at the end of November. Thank you all so much to our wonderful speakers. Thank you again. Yeah, enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're joining us from, and see you soon.